All right. Hello, everybody out there. So welcome to another edition of Casey Lee Live, Software Edition. This is the fifth one, I believe, we've been doing, and we've been doing this weekly on Thursday nights. If you're new to here, welcome. If you are, an existing viewer, welcome back. And so usually we just take a couple minutes to let people kind of filter in and kind of get into this. So, hello, everybody out there. That was a technical issue. I have a live feed just to make sure everything's going all right over here. Forgot to turn down the volume on that. So, anyways, so yeah, if you're on the chat and you're comfortable, say hello. Let me know everything's going all right. Again, if you guys are new to this, I always just kind of do a little bit of a disclaimer to say that this is a live broadcast using Open Broadcaster software, which is a great piece of software, but every now and then it does crash. So if the feed cuts out for whatever reason, just send me a message or just wait a couple seconds. I just have to restart the software and everything will be good. So, so if you guys are new to this, what this basically is a live stream that we do every Thursday nights. We do every Thursday night on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. And what it's been is just kind of covering software topics. And what I've been trying to do over the last couple weeks is kind of focus on topics that are generally universal. I think I'm starting to run out of a universal idea, so we're going to start to get more specific into specific languages and specific technologies, at least the ones that I'm familiar with. And definitely, if you guys have any suggestions or anything that you'd like me to cover or anything that you'd like to see on these series, definitely message me. You can follow me on Twitter right there. You can also leave a comment on these YouTube videos. You send me a message in this chat, or if you're watching this in the recorded version, just leave a comment and I'll get those. And again, I'm really trying to let the audience drive this a lot. But until I get overwhelming feedback, I'm just going to kind of dictate the topics, myself. Now, again, if you're new to this, the way this usually works is we usually break it down into kind of like a formal lesson or kind of a formal, talk about a specific topic. So today we're talking about ORMs, and then usually that's followed by any Q&A that you guys might have. And the Q&A doesn't have to be specific to the topic. I actually started this off as kind of a little bit like an AMA. Just ask me anything, any software related topics, anything about starting a business, anything like that. I'm happy to answer. But as this went on, again, the formal lesson is something that I think people really enjoy. But when we get to the Q&A section, you can really ask me about anything. Well, really, even before we get to that, you can ask me anything. So if you guys want to ask me questions, you can join in on the live chat. A couple things about the live chat just to mention. Do know that this is public and it is a recorded chat. So again, if you're concerned about privacy, then maybe you want to sign in with an account that doesn't have your full name in it or things like that. Or you might want to retract your messages afterwards. So things like that, just to be wary of. So and so that brings me to the next point, that if you ever miss any of these things live, again, live Thursday nights at 8 p.m., if you miss them, you can always watch these afterwards. They will go up on YouTube as a recorded video, usually within a couple, like maybe even half an hour or even less, it's up on YouTube. So if you ever miss it, you can always go on that. So again, this is our fifth week we've been doing this, and I've been really enjoying this. Obviously, with the situation that's happening around the world right now, I know lots more and more people are doing live streams. It's definitely something that I got into because of it. But I do plan to continue this after things kind of get back to quote normal. So I've really been enjoying this. This definitely kickstarted something here that I really enjoy and really enjoy to share the knowledge, and it's also caused me to learn a lot of stuff. It's got some questions last week and the week before that caused me to learn a lot of stuff, and even tonight. I'm going to be learning a little bit of stuff because I've never actually done what I've done that I'm about to do tonight. I did a little bit of preparation just to make sure it wasn't a complete flop, but I've never actually done this. I've kind of had theories about this. Haven't done this. Actually, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I've done it specifically for one project, but that was a long time ago, and it didn't do it in full. So, what I really liked about last week, it was a little bit of a challenge to me as well. Like last week, we kind of covered recreating the Airbnb landing page, and I didn't know how that was going to go. And same thing tonight. Tonight's a little bit of a challenge to me. I haven't really done a ton of prep for this, so we're just going to see how it goes. Hopefully, those who are tuning in, you'll get a little bit of knowledge from the little bit of talk that I give before we start to get into the code. But in the coding piece, hopefully you'll learn a lot as well. But at the same time, I'm going to be learning a lot because I haven't really done it that much myself. So welcome again, Casey Lee Live Software Edition. If you haven't already, subscribed to the channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I go live. We definitely have a couple people on watching right now. Not too much. We have a smaller crowd again tonight, but again, I'm happy to do this. Always, if there's at least one person watching, I'm happy to cater to that audience. And again, plus people watch this afterwards as well. But if you are one of those couple people that are online right now watching, I think it's like 2 people or so, definitely feel free to message and take over what you want to learn, right? So I really do appreciate the people who do join me live. It does make it a little bit more exciting to have somewhat of an audience. And it's something that I want to grow. So, I definitely plan to do this more and more. Like I said, if even one person's listening, I'm very happy. But hopefully we can grow that to even more people. So spread the word. Let your friends and family know. If anybody's interested in software at all, definitely join that. So, okay, so I'm going to just get started. I will try to monitor the chat as much as I can, but let's just jump right into it. So, still getting used to a little bit of the camera switching here. I watched some of the previous live streams and realized I wasn't switching at the right time, but hopefully I'll remember that today. Okay, so today we are going to cover object relation mapping, or ORM. So this actually, I believe, stemmed from a question that one of my students and friends, Mark, messaged me about, and what ORMs are, or what they're about, and my opinion of ORMs. And so this kind of definitely planted the seed in my head, and I thought about it a little more, and I thought this would be a great topic to cover this week. Again, I was genuinely struggling to find a good topic, and this is the one that I came up with, and I think it's going to be a great topic actually to cover. So we're going to cover object relation mapping, or ORMs as they are known as. So let's jump into what exactly this is all about. Okay, so when you're a software developer, right, you probably learn to code a little bit, and you probably learn to code. Maybe you start in the web, or maybe you start on mobile, or maybe you start doing desktop apps. Maybe you start in university doing a course in Java or Python or something like that, and you write code. And I'm just kind of using the word app as really like encompassing any piece of software that you write, basically, right? So when you start to write an app, you are probably going to have a lot of data that's flying around. What I mean by that is you probably have variables that you're assigning. You might be doing object-oriented programming. So you might have classes and methods, and inside those classes, you're kind of, writing data to variables and reading data from variables, setting, var this equals that or whatever. You have a lot of data flying around in your app. And you may even have, if you've gotten to this point in your software career, you might be actually asking for input from the user. You may get the user to input something, and then you use that data somehow, right? And when you write an app, you have all this data that's flying around, and at some point, you're probably going to want to store that data persistently. Some apps not. Like, again, if you're writing a calculator apps, a lot of times you just, whatever data is right there, it's good, and then you're done with it, right? Or sometimes if you're writing like a chess game or something like that, you play it, and then as soon as you close the program, you're done. But there's a lot of apps out there, or a lot of software that you write, where probably at some point you're going to want to store that data persistently. And we talked about this, 2 weeks ago when we talked about databases and SQL databases. And how we talked about how databases are kind of a way to store data persistently. In other words, when you shut down your app code, or when you shut down the computer and you turn on your computer again, that data is still there, right? So at some point, you're going to want to grab whatever data is in your app code, so whatever that's in variables or objects or whatever, and you're going to want to somehow get that into the database, or out of the database, right? Maybe when you turn the computer back on or turn your program back on, you might want to read from the database, right? And so when it comes to this, we kind of hinted at this when we did our kind of session on SQL databases. We talked about, there are commands that you can execute against a database that's going to store that information in there, right? So I kind of hinted at, well, then how are you going to really get the app code to do that for you, right? And so I talked about there were libraries, adapters, and, like database adapters or database drivers that you could have. And those kind of adapters and drivers were basically libraries that allowed you to connect to a database and execute SQL queries, right? Or whatever database backend you're using, right? I'm going to use SQL as my example here. But the idea is that you would write code that uses those methods and those classes and everything so that you can basically insert data into the database or update data into the database or delete data from the database or read data from that database, right? And so when you start to do this, and if you're just starting out and you basically just want to get this data in there, you might kind of start kind of spaghetti coding it, which basically means like you might just kind of write the code whenever and wherever you need it, right? So you might ask the user for some data, and then you kind of use it, and then like, oh, when they hit save, okay, I'll write a method there to save the data to the database. Or okay, when they click on read this entry, okay, maybe I'll read that row from the database and grab that data and kind of have some code there, and then have kind of code all over the app, right? And we might end up with something like this where wherever we need it, it's just kind of scattered all over our app, right? They're just little bits of SQL statements where we connect to the database and we execute a SQL statement, and it just does exactly what we need at any given time. And then you have all these kind of little bits of code everywhere. And on top of that, you might be doing it in a way that's very specific to that specific use case, right? Exactly at the time when the person clicks the button or when the program gets to that part, you're going to use that data and run it that way, right? And that's fine. That's totally fine, and that's a way to do it. But there are some issues with that. If you kind of do it that way, first of all, your code might kind of get messy, and it may be hard to maintain, and you might not have that much reusable code. So every time you're doing this, you might have to reconnect to the database, and you might have to write the SQL statement again, right? You might write the SQL statement multiple times to do inserts and all this stuff like that. And it kind of gets messy, and it's not maintainable and not reusable, and kind of violates a lot of the software engineering principles that you live by, right? So that's a great way to start if you're just learning. But then at some point, you might want to try to think of a more structured way about how to code this stuff. Like where do we want to put the code that connects to the database and executes a SQL statement? Where do we want to put the code that reads the data from the database? These kind of things, right? And so let's take object-oriented programming as our example. Okay, so if you're an object-oriented programmer, one of the first things they teach you is always to think in terms of objects, right? And so when you read a problem description, it's like, oh, okay, you have been tasked with building an application where users can order products online, and they'll get invoices, and they can view their orders, and they can have support tickets and all this stuff, right? And one of the things they teach you in object-oriented design is to always think in terms of the nouns of your problem, right? So we have users, products, invoices, support tickets, these kind of things, right? These are the objects that we design, right? And what's great about it is we start to really think about how we might structure that data, right? We start to think about how we are going to have a user, and the user is going to have an email address and a first name and a last name and maybe an age, these kind of things. A product is going to have a name and a description and maybe a serial number and a price, these kind of things, right? Like we start to, this is what we call kind of like software design, right? Where we're designing the data structures, the algorithms, the architecture, all these kind of things, right? So if we're doing object-oriented programming, what's great is we are already thinking about how the data is going to be structured, right? I say we create these data encapsulations through classes and objects. So we already think about where the data is going to be and how it's going to be structured, right? So we're not just going to have name variables out in the open. Those name variables are going to be belong to a user object, right? And we're starting to do that already. So we start to think about these encapsulations, and we start to do all that design in our head, or maybe write it down, or maybe we do a UML diagram or something like that. And we come up with things like this, right? So I have some Ruby code on the left, where we can instantiate a user, and then we set the user ID, and we set the age, and then we set the first name, and then we can put S is kind of like outputting to the screen or to the console. Then we can put the user's first name out to the screen, okay? But we're able to do that really easily because we've already thought about how the object looks, and that's kind of what's represented on the right here, right? We have this kind of UML-ish diagram here of what a user class might be, right? So we have a class called user, and it has properties of ID, first name, last name, age, and student number, right? And that's how we envision the data. And that's what we go through as object-oriented programmers, right? We always think about how we're going to encapsulate this data, right, into classes and objects, right? So those are the objects that we deal with. And objects are in memory in the sense that when we shut down the program, they're done, they're dead, right? And when we shut down our computer, they're gone, they're dead, right? So these are in memory objects that we deal with. Okay, now last couple weeks when we talked about databases, we talked about organizing data into tables and rows, right? And if you think about it, that's really just another way to encapsulate your data, right? So objects is one way to encapsulate data. There are many ways to encapsulate data, and objects is one of those ways. And database tables and rows are another way, right? Like we start to think about that. If we're going to store our data in the database, we start to think, okay, maybe we'll have a users table, and the users table will have an ID column, a name column, an age column, a student number column, these kind of things, right? So database tables and rows are another way to encapsulate data. And when you get into database design, this is what you're talking about as well. You're talking about how the data is structured and how it's going to be stored, right? And how it's going to be read and all these things. So here we have two places where we're encapsulating data, right? So here's the database side, and I just showed you the object side, right? And so what's great is that we already are doing all this great good software engineering by doing this great database design or doing this great object oriented design, right? And we have now two great designed data structures. We have an object data structure and a database data structure, right? So we have these two great data structures. And so why don't we leverage that fact that we have two encapsulations that are great? They're two, it's hard to talk around the mic here. We have two encapsulations of data, of the same piece of data, by the way. They represent the same piece of data, and they're designed almost the same way, right? Like they encapsulate the same data. So why don't we leverage that fact when we talk about writing to the database and reading from the database, right? Why don't we leverage that fact that the objects and the database are kind of similar, right? They have same types of fields, right? And so why don't we write our code to basically map the data that's in the objects to the data that's in the database rows? In other words, why don't we write some code that makes the object user ID map to the database row user's ID, right? Like, why don't we do that? Why don't we map the data that's in the object to the data that's in the database rows? Okay. That is what an ORM is. Okay. ORM literally stands for object relation mapping. Object comes from the object-oriented world, so the objects that you're dealing with. R stands for relation, and relation, as far as I know, is referring to the relational database. So SQL databases are typically called relational databases. Relational databases, we haven't really gotten into this in this live stream, but relational databases are basically databases where you have a bunch of tables and they're all related. You have relational data, so you have the users that are joined to their products or their orders or something like that, right? And then M is the mapping piece. So the code that's literally going to take the name in the user object and map it to the name in the database row in users, right? So it's code that maps between the in-memory object to the persistent relational database row. Okay, that's the best way to think about ORM. It's the code that does that. Okay, so this is what it would do. Okay, so it would basically, it's code that would do what's represented by the arrows here. It's code that would map the ID, the first name, the last name, the age, and the student number between the database row and the object up on the left here. And it's bidirectional, right? It's taking the values that you have in memory and writing them to the database, or taking the values that are in the database and reading them out into an object. Okay, that's what ORM is supposed to do. Okay. All right, so this is what we're getting at. So it's the code that's kind of like the bridge between the object and the database. Okay. So how do we code it? Well, a couple things about ORMs. So what I consider a good ORM, I mean, probably most people, I always say me just in case I'm getting this wrong, but a good ORM is generally a collection of methods or functions or objects or classes, basically a bunch of code that is really intended to allow a developer to easily read a database row into an object or write an object into a database row, right? So either getting the data out of the database and putting it into an object, or getting the object's data and putting it back into the database row. Now, one thing I want to be very clear about this statement here, okay, is that it allows a developer to easily do this, okay? So an ORM is a tool that developers use. Okay, developers code it as well, but then once you've coded these methods and these objects and these classes, then you as a developer or other developers will use that code to easily read stuff from the database and write stuff into the database. Okay, so an ORM is not the full solution to get your end users to do it, right? You're still going to build an application on top of your ORM, right? So the best way to think of it is ORM is really a tool for the developer, okay? It's a library for the developer to allow them to easily read a database row into an object or write an object into a database row. Okay, that's what an ORM is. Okay, so this is what it might look like. Okay, so here's some pseudocode. Okay, so it's not really any specific language. It kind of is Ruby. It's kind of JavaScript. It's kind of pseudocode. Okay, so this is not real code, but it might look something like this. Okay, so we might code a method that as part of our ORM. Okay, so we might have a class of a bunch of methods or whatever. And one of the methods that we code is called read user from the database. And you pass in an ID of that user. Okay, so that's an ORM method. Okay, and then the other developers can write code like this: user equals read user from the database 1. Okay, and what that should do is it should go to the database and fetch a user with ID 1 and massage it into an object that then gets returned into the user variable. And then at that point, it's just a regular object that the developer can use. They can output to the screen user.getAge or whatever, right? So whatever they do with that afterwards is fine. But you've now really taken the complication out of converting that database row into an object by putting it behind this read user from DB method. So you create this really powerful method that just reads a user from the database and converts it into an object and spits it back out to whoever decides to use it. Right? So this way, whoever uses my ORM method doesn't have to think about the database. They don't have to think about the select statement that's going on in there. They just do read user from DB and then they're done. Okay. All right. So what would the internals of that kind of look like? What would kind of be a general algorithm that read user from DB might do? Okay. So here's a little bit of pseudocode for what it might do or what it might look like. Okay. So let's say it's this function, read user from database, that takes in an integer. Okay, again, this is pseudocode. It's not a specific language. It's just fake code. And this is what it might do. It might do something like this. Okay, first thing it might do is connect to the database. So using a database driver and adapter, it might connect to the database. And then what it might do is execute some kind of SQL statement. Okay, I have here execute select statement with an ID. Okay, so that might execute some statement and returns a row. And then what I'm going to do is instantiate a object, okay? So the first two lines here, the connect to database and result row, that's just going to get the database row into memory. So that's the database row part. But now I got to convert that into an in-memory object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate a brand new user, okay? Just an empty user, and set all of its properties to the properties that I get from the row. Okay, so I manually set all those properties. And then now I have this user, this loaded up user that represents that row. And now I'm going to send that back and return that user. Okay, so we're going to go through this in more detail, but this is just kind of a general idea of what might happen in there. Okay, let's talk about the other way. Maybe we want to write an object to the database. So maybe the developer uses my ORM the other way around. So maybe they create a brand new user. So user equals user.new. And then they set the age of that user and they set the first name of that user. And now they have this user that's in memory and they want to save it to the database. So then they call my ORM method, write user to the database, and they pass in that user. Okay. And again, they don't have to know how that works. This is the brilliant thing about coding a good ORM, is that the developers that use it don't need to know how that works. They just know it's going to save it to the database. But we, as the ORM programmers, know that this is what it might look like. Okay, so what we might do is we might code it this way. So we have this write user to the database, which takes in a user. So what we do is we connect to the database. We create this insert statement. We say insert into users, the age, the name, all that stuff, and we concatenate that with values. Okay. And then we execute the insert statement. Okay. So that might be a way that we do it. Now, one thing I should mention here, just because I don't want anybody to get in trouble, this code that you see right here is pseudocode, and just to give you an idea of what the algorithm might look like. This specific way of doing it with concatenating strings and stuff like that, you have to be very, very, very careful of, because it's prone to an attack known as SQL injection. So if you are coding your own ORM, just be very careful that you don't do it this way with the concatenation. Okay, it's kind of like that, but just be very careful of that. Okay, because and you can look up SQL injection to find out what that's all about. Okay, but this is the general idea: is the idea that you would pass in an object, connect to the database, and execute a SQL statement based on the values that are in that object. Okay, so when you have a good ORM, basically that good ORM is going to allow developers to mainly deal with the objects and not worry too much about the underlying database commands, okay? So when you code an ORM, you create this interface that allows a developer to just do things like read from the database, write from the database, but without being concerned about the low-level connection details and without concern of like the low-level SQL statements or whatever statements you're using or whatever database you're using. Okay, all they know is they can just write and read to the database freely, okay, and just deal with the objects that are a lot easier to deal with, right? When you're programming object-oriented programming language, dealing with objects is a really nice way to program, right? So that's the other thing I like to think about. Like when I think about ORMs, the whole idea of an ORM to me is you're converting a database row into a form that's way easier to play with as a developer. And what I'm talking about there is an object. An object's way easier to deal with when you're programming than a bunch of just values that are like in a database row just spit back to you as like a string or something like that, and vice versa. Okay, so that is what an ORM is all about. Okay, now when we talk about this, one thing you should know is that there is not only one way to code an ORM. There are many, 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 many different ORM models out there and different ways of doing it. Okay, and even of the same ORM model, there are different implementations of it, right? So there are different libraries that implement those ORM models, okay? So today, we are going to implement an ORM model known as active record, okay? So active record is a philosophy about how to code an ORM, and we are going to implement it, okay? And that, in fact, the reason I'm doing this is because this is the ORM model that Ruby on Rails actually uses. And it's the one I'm most familiar with because, again, my day-to-day job, I do Ruby on Rails a lot, right? So that's what we're going to code, okay? So we're going to code this from scratch. Now, before we get started, one thing you should know is that a lot of the time, you would not be doing this. You would not be building your own ORM, especially if you're getting started, especially if you're kind of new to database writes, reads and writes and stuff like that. A lot of times you would not be building your own ORM. In fact, most of the time what would happen is you'd actually use one that other people have built for you, okay? And there's a bunch out there. If you're coding in Ruby, there's active record. If you're coding in Java, there's a library called Hibernate. That's an ORM. I had to look up some of these, and I don't know how popular these are, but Python, there's something called SQL Alchemy and Django ORM. Node has something called SQLize and Type ORM. And then Swift has a framework called Core Data, which is a whole bunch of things. But sitting inside there is a little ORM, actually. It's a lot more than just an ORM. Core Data is a lot bigger than just an ORM, but part of it is an ORM, allowing you to easily, again, write objects to the database and say them back and forth, right? And, all these implement different, not all of them, but a lot of them implement different ORM models and implement in different ways. So what you see here today is not the only way to do an ORM. It's just one of the ways we're doing it, okay? Now, even though most of the time what you'd be doing is just using an ORM, okay, I thought what would be really helpful is that if you saw one built from scratch, that you would understand how they actually work in the backend, or at least have an idea of how they work in the backend. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to try to build our own ORM. Okay, all right, let's get started here. Okay, so I'm actually going to be coding this in Ruby. So if you guys have never coded in Ruby, it is an object-oriented programming language, not too dissimilar from things like Java or C Sharp, and I believe Python. I've never really done Python, but it's very minimalist compared to some of those languages. You don't have to do a lot of declaration, things like that. But I will try to keep Ruby specific things to a minimum, just so most people can kind of understand the concepts in their own language. Okay. All right. So what I have here is I have a Ruby program, this main.rb, and I'm just going to comment this out stuff. So hashtag and Ruby's comment out. I'm just going to comment all this stuff out here, and I'm just going to do a hello world. So put S basically outputs to the console what you write here. So it takes in a string. So we can kind of look at it this way. So it's a method call, and it takes in a string. So I can say hello world. Okay. And then what I can do is I can actually run that code over here. Okay, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so hopefully you guys can see it better. Okay. So here we are. Actually, why don't I open up a new tab, just clear it out. Be a lot easier. Okay. So I'm in the folder and I'm just going to run that program. So if I type in Ruby and then run that program, which is this main.rb file, I hit enter. Okay. And then it prints out hello world. Okay. So there we go. Okay. So just a heads up, you definitely will need to know a little bit of SQL databases, and you will definitely need to know what some object-oriented principles are, such as classes, objects, instantiation, those kind of things. Okay. So let's start really simple, and we're going to base our program on what we did 2 weeks ago in our SQL databases. So I actually have that open over here. 2 weeks ago, we started to build a SQL database, and we built it as an e-commerce app here. Okay, and this is running on my server, port 5434, I believe. And we actually built a couple tables in here, right? So if we look at our schemas and we look at our tables, we actually have products and users. So I was doing this earlier today. If I do a select star from products, you can see that there are the rows here. You have an ID column, a name column, a price column, a serial number. And if I do a select star from users, you can see what's in there. Okay, so there's an ID, a first name, a last name, email, and an age. Okay, so that's what the data looks like. Okay, so that's what the database looks like. Let's start off by creating the object that's going to map to this. Okay, so before we have an ORM, we kind of need the object and we kind of need the database before we actually build the bridge in between, right? So the database is already built. Let's start by building the object. Okay, and what I'm going to focus on today, we'll see if there's time to do both, but let's just focus. I don't think there's going to be. But let's just focus on the products. Okay, so if we look at the products have an ID, a name, a price, and a serial number. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, so here's the code here. And right now, the only thing that this does is hello world. Okay, so what I want to start off with is I want to build a product class. Okay, so I actually have another file here. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment everything out, but there is a reference there just so I don't get completely lost. Okay. And what I'm going to do is just create an empty class, okay? So in Ruby, all you have to do is say class, product, and end. Okay, so one thing in Ruby that is definitely different than other languages is you don't have those curly braces that a lot of languages have. JavaScript has those curly braces in Java. So in Java, right, you would do, public, I believe, class, product, curly brace, close curly brace, like that. Okay, these are kind of the equivalent. Okay, and then I believe Python probably has indentation, like class product, and then you'd indent or whatever, something like that. Okay, anyways, so we have a class product here, and the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a constructor. Okay, so to define a constructor in Ruby, you do initialize. All right, and let's just start off really simple. We're going to create a bunch of instance variables and just assign them to empty things right now. Okay, so for product, what do we have? We have an ID, a name, a price, and a serial number. Okay, so we're going to say ID. And the way you do instance variables in Ruby is with an @ sign. So any @ sign, you create an instance variable, and that instance variable will be accessible through any instance methods, right? Okay, and let's just assign these to dummy variables right now. So @ID, what is it? ID, name, price, and serial number. So name, we'll just do an empty string for now. Price, to $0 and serial number. Okay, and an empty string. Okay, so we have an empty product there. Okay, and let's see if that works. Okay, so we'll come back to our main here. We'll say hello world. Let's just replace that with instantiating product. Okay, and then we'll say done. And so if it gets to that part in the code without an error, we're good to go. Okay, so we're going to instantiate a new product. Now, for us to be able to actually use this file in here, we have to require it. So I'm just going to uncomment that code here. So we have require product RB. So now that this code here can be used in here. And I'm going to instantiate a new product. Okay, so I'm going to create a variable called product. Okay, unlike a lot of languages, you don't need to declare it with a variable or the type. Okay. And then we're going to instantiate it. So to instantiate a class in Ruby, you call the class and .new. Okay, so .new is going to instantiate it and call that initialize method. Okay, so that's going to instantiate the product. Let's just make sure that runs. Perfect. So instantiate product, done, no errors, so we're good to go. Okay. Now let's just do a little bit of some getters and setters. So let's define, say, a set ID, and that will take in an ID. Okay, and then we'll define a get ID, right, with no parameters. Again, if you are a Ruby programmer, you'll notice I am using a lot of extra parentheses where I don't need to, but again, trying to make this a little bit universal. So let's say we'll do a set name. We're passing the name. We'll do a get name. Okay, we'll do a set price. And a get price. And then lastly, a set serial number. And get serial number. Okay. So what we want to do here, if we want to set the ID, so we want to set the instance variable ID equal to whatever gets passed in there. And here we just want to return ID. Okay. Now in Ruby, you can leave out the return, but we'll put it in. All right. And for the rest of these, I'm going to do the exact same thing here. I'm going to show you some really cool multi-select action here with Sublime. Command D. VS Code can do this as well. Again, big thanks to Dave for introducing me to Command D. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to multi-select the set, these set guys here. Whoops. Okay, I'm just going to add them all at the same time here. So I'm going to grab what it's setting, okay, and say at that equals that. Okay, there we go. So at name equals name, at price equals price, at serial number equals serial number. And then we're going to do the same thing with the gets. So let's select the gets. Okay, there we go. So return, oh, I guess we can say return on all these. Okay, there we go. So it's all the setters and getters for all our instance variables. Let's put them to the test. Okay, so here we go. So let's say product.setName, and we'll say MacBook. We'll say product.set ID equal to 1. Let's say product.set, what else? What do we have? Price and serial number. So price we'll set to, say, $12.99. Oh, actually, this we want it to be an integer. And we'll set the serial number. So set serial number, and then we'll say something like that. Okay, so there we go. So we set all those variables. And to make sure they're set properly, let's output them. Okay. So I'm going to say, okay, so setting up product. And we're going to output these. So let's say I'm going to output the name. So get name. And then I'm going to output the ID. Output the price. And output the serial number. Let's see if that worked. Okay. Oh, we got an error here. Did we mean at name? So there's something undefined here where we product line number 22. So what's going on line 22? Oh, yeah. sorry, so my returns are wrong because I need to return the instance variable, right? So at ID, at name, at price, and at serial number. Okay, let's try that again. And there we go. Okay, so set up the product, and we set all the variables, and we output them here. Okay, so that's great. Now, something else we might want to do is, we might want to create a constructor that takes all these in, right? That's usually very common to do. So up in my initialize here, let's actually take in an ID, a name, a price, and a serial number. All right. So here we'll say ID, name, price, and serial number. Okay. So now what we should be able to do is reduce this line to product equals product.new and pass in order. So ID, name, price, serial number. So ID, name, price, and serial number. Okay, so I can get rid of all this now. All right, and we should get the same result. There we go. Just going to adjust my mic. I keep hitting it, and it's probably annoying you guys a little bit. All right, there we go. So we got the same results. That's great. And if we change any of these, so say MacBook Pro, say $13.99, MVP, and say ID number 2, save that. If we run that again, there we go. Okay, MacBook 2, Okay, maybe we'll put the ID first just so it's in the same order. All right, so that's great. So now we got our object. Okay, so we got our object with a nice, we have a nice initialize, and we have all these things here. Okay. All right, so now we have our object, and we have a database. So now we're ready to basically, ready now to create our ORM. Okay, so there's a couple things we want to do in our ORM. Okay, so with active record, okay, the model of ORM that we're following, okay, we actually focus all of our ORM methods directly on the object itself. Okay. So the way we're going to deal with this is we're not going to create another class that takes in a product and writes it or whatever. We're going to put those methods directly on the product class and write and read from that, okay? So that's one of the things about Active Record. But another thing about Active Record you should know is that generally the way it works is you want to read and write entire objects to and from the database, okay? Not specific ID or name or serial number, but the entire object you're going to write to the database or read from the database. Okay. So the idea is that whatever state that the product is in, we're going to write entirely to the database. Okay. Okay. So the very first thing I want to do is this. Okay. So once I kind of set up my product, what I want to do is I am going to ideally have some ORM. Okay. Ideally, I want to have my ORM save my product to the database. Okay. Or I should say maybe write my product to the database. Write my product to the database. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I am ideally going to have some method on the product that writes it to the database. And I'm going to follow Ruby on Rails lead. But you could call this whatever you want. But I'm going to create some kind of method that basically says save. I'm going to call that save. Okay. And when I call this method, what it's going to do is it's going to write this product to the database. Okay. So we don't know what this looks like yet, but we're going to write that. Okay. So let's implement that method. Okay. So we have all our product stuff up here, and then down below here, I'm going to start our ORM methods, okay? So ORM methods. All right. So the very first method I'm going to write is save, okay? So let's just define a method called save. And for now, let's just put some log messages in there, okay? So writing product to the database. Done, okay? Just so we have some kind of sense of what's happening there, okay? So let's run this. Okay, so setting up the product, it output all the values here, okay? And then it's writing to the product to the database, and now it's done. So let's say done program here. And let's say done database. Right. Okay. Now it's not actually doing anything, but now we have log messages. Okay. See how far it gets. All right. So now in here is where we start to write our ORM code that's going to take what we have in here and write it to the database over here. Okay. So let's do it this way. All right. So what we can do is, first thing we need to do is we actually need to import our database connector or a library. Okay. So remember I said, like, to even get this going and to even execute SQL statements against a database, you need a database driver or a database adapter. Okay. Now I'm not going to get into the details of how this works in Ruby, but basically I can import a library that connects to Postgres. Okay. So I'm doing this through a gem file. It's called PG. Okay. I've actually already imported it before I started, and to use it, all I have to do is require it. Okay. Just looking at my reference down here. Yeah. So all I have to do is type in require PG, and now I have access to any methods that are in that library. Okay. Same thing like importing or including in other languages. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do in the save is a couple things, right? So one of the first things I need to do is I need to connect to the database. Then I need to create some kind of SQL statement. And then I need to execute that SQL statement. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to reference some code here down here because I haven't done this a lot. Okay, so to set up a connection, what I can do is call pg connection.new. Okay, so this is a object in this library pg, and I'm going to instantiate it. And what I can do is I can pass in some values. Okay, so what I can do is I can pass in a hash of values. Now, if you don't know what a hash is, you'll have to look that up. But basically think of it as key value pairs. Okay, and this is the connection information to connect to my database. Okay, and the database we are connecting to is the e-commerce app. And I did set up a user called example user. And its password is example password. Okay, so that's how you connect to a database. Well, sorry, that's not how you connect. It is how you connect, but we then do things off of that connection, okay? So what that actually returns is an instance of connection. Okay. So now we have the connection to the database, and now we're ready to actually execute a statement. Okay. So what we can actually do is we could actually do something like this. Connection.execute, and we could do our own insert statement. Okay, so let's just try it. Let's just try it for fun. Okay, so we'll say insert into products. We're going to insert the ID, name, price, and serial number. Name, price, and serial number. Okay, and the values we're going to insert are going to be, say, 3. What do we have there so far? We have the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. So let's say the iPad. Say $499, and serial number, let's say, is IP13. Okay. So let's see if this actually works. So if we run the save method, what it's going to do is going to connect to the database, and then it's just going to run this insert statement. Okay. So let's see if that works. So come back to our terminal here and run it. Okay. So set up the product, wrote to the database, done the database, right? Okay. So that theoretically connected to the database and executed an insert statement. Let's see if that actually worked. So select star from products. Okay. And it did not work. All right. So let's see what might be happening there. So definitely connect to the e-commerce app. So insert into products, ID, name, price, serial number. am I missing? All right. So, like I said, this is a challenge. What am I missing there? E-commerce app. All right. User example, password. Let's just double check here that this connection's actually working. Just going to do a quick debugging here. Give me a second. Oh, we need to require pry to do that. Okay, let me just debug this. Okay, so the connection's working fine. Let's see here. Let's see if I can run a delete statement. Okay, so delete statement worked. Why did our insert statement not work? Maybe my syntax was broken. Insert into products. Say the ID, values, 4. Okay, so that did work. So I must have typed something wrong here. Products ID, name, price, serial number. We're passing in 3. Let me just try a simpler statement and see if that works. Okay, so let's run the program again. So it's done. Oh, it is there. I guess it just took some time to get there. So, yeah. Okay, so it looks like that statement did work. Okay, so it's working now. Okay, so we did a connection there, and we executed this insert into products ID values 5. And if we run it again and again, it's just going to keep inserting, right? So we run this 2 more times. Okay, so if we play this again, there we go. There is that row a couple times. Okay, so definitely filling up the database, and we know how to insert that. Okay, so now that's just inserting our own hard-coded values. What if we want to actually insert the values that came from this object? Okay, now again, this is an instance method, so we have access to all these instance variables, right? So don't forget, we're inside the object right now. So first thing I'm going to do is just assign this SQL statement out to a variable, just to make this a little bit easier. Okay, so we'll just assign it out here, and then just execute it down here. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to insert into products, and again, the values we want to insert are ID, name, price, and serial number. Okay, and the values we want to insert, again, this is for demonstration purposes. You typically do not want to do it this way. You want to use something called prepared statements. But again, we don't really have full time to go into prepared statements today. So I'm just going to concatenate the string to create the SQL statement. But you do not want to do this in general. Okay, you want to look up prepared statements. But for teaching purposes, here we go. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to use something called string interpolation. All right, so I'm just going to use that. Actually, I'm going to do concatenation because people are probably more familiar with concatenation. Okay. So I'm going to append the ID that's part of the user. All right. And I'm just going to put this on a new line to make this a little bit, not take as much horizontal room here. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll say, there we go. Okay. So insert into products, values, and what we want to do is we want to put a comma after that. Okay. And then after the comma, we want to add the name. Guess we don't really need spaces, but whatever. And then what do we have? The price. Okay. And the serial number. Now, before we execute it, what I'd like to do is I'd like to just see what that statement looks like. Okay. Actually, we don't need a comma at the last one. Okay, so before we execute it, let's just take a look at what it looks like. So I'm going to output this to the command line and see what it looks like. Okay. So plus no implicit conversion integer to string. Right. Okay. So you can't convert an integer to a string. So I have to explicitly convert the integer to a string. So 2s. Same thing goes for this, which is the price. Okay. So this is what my statement looks like right now. So insert into products, parentheses, ID, name, price, serial number, values, 2 MacBook Pro, 39. Okay, so there's two things wrong with this. One, I don't have the end parenthesis. And two, I don't have the necessary quotation marks around the character values that go into the SQL statement. All right, so first things first, let's add that thing there. And then we need quotation marks around the character values. Okay, let's see what it looks like now. Okay, so insert into products, ID, name, price, serial number, values, 2 MacBook Pro. Okay, this is looking great. Okay, that's exactly the command that we want to execute. Okay. And what's great about this is dependent on the instance variables in this object. So if I go back to my main here and I change this, say to like 6, and I change this to say iPhone 11 Pro, let's say I do that, you'll see the insert statement changes to this, right? So this is where you can see the advantages of the ORM taking place, right? Because now, once you've coded that save method, okay, you can just deal with the object over here and not worry about how that save is working. Okay. All right. I'm just going to get rid of all this code here. And let's see what we have now. Okay. So setting up the product, writing product to the database. Okay. So this is the thing that's going to be called this insert statement. And then we're done the database, right? Okay. So let's do this. Okay, so we're going to actually execute the command rather than just output it. And let's see if that works. Okay, so let's take a look at the state of the database right now. Okay, so we have a bunch of rows in here. I'm just going to delete all these rows. Okay, and just start from scratch. So I'm going to delete from products. Okay, so if I look at products now, there. Oh, again. Okay, just taking a little bit of time. There, it's gone now. Okay, so it's empty. So let's start from scratch. We'll say product number 1, iPhone 11 Pro, $13.99, 11 Pro, and we'll save it, which should then call save, which is going to construct this SQL query for us and then execute it. All right, so let's run that. Okay, it's done. Run this again. And there it goes. Okay. So now it becomes really easy to insert stuff in the database. So watch. So now that I have this ORM method, I can just do this. Okay. So let's say I have 2, just the regular iPhone 11. All right. I can write a bunch of these things, right? 3, 4, 5. Let's say we have the iPhone SE. All right, let's say I have the iPad Pro 11. And let's say I have the iPad Pro 13. Okay, so I have all those now. And I can run that. Okay, it ran it 4 times. Look in here. And there it goes. Okay. So what I've effectively done here is I've taken object-oriented code and wrote a simple method called save, which handles the database stuff for me. Okay, that's the essence of ORM. Okay, let's do the other way around now. We've done saving to the database. How about reading from the database? Okay. Now, there's 2 ways you could approach this. You could say, okay, well, why don't we say ideally, okay, I want to comment all this out now that we know how that works. Ideally, we could say something like this. Okay, maybe I instantiate a new product. Okay. And maybe I do something like read, from database. And what that would do is it would read a record from the database into that product. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. I'm actually going to take it a different way on how Ruby on Rails does it. Okay, so I'm actually going to create a class level method. Now, for those who don't know what class level methods are basically methods that you can call on the class itself. .new is one of those examples. .new is a method that you're calling on the class itself, right? Whereas all these other methods we're calling on the instance, right? So we're going to create a class level method. And because we don't actually have a product to start with until we fetch it, okay, then what I'm going to do is create a class level method, and then that way I can call it without needing to instantiate a product to do that in the first place. So what I'm going to do is directly here, I'm going to do something like read, okay, from database. Okay. Now there's a couple things we could do here. We could read an individual record, or we could read a collection of records. Okay. And since we don't know necessarily, well, actually, let's start with the easiest one, which is read a single record. Okay. So let's read a single record from this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a method called find. Okay. And again, this is just borrowing from Ruby on Rails. This is how they name theirs. And what it's going to take in, it's going to take in an ID. And what it's going to return is an object version of whatever that database row is with the ID of 3. Okay. So let's see how we write this. Okay. So back to our ORM area. So we've done the save. Okay. So I'm going to create a class level method that takes in an ID. Okay. In Java, you use the word static. In Ruby, there's actually a couple ways to do it here, and I don't know how to do it in Python. Okay, so let's just make sure this works again. So let's say reading or finding record from database. All right, and let's just make sure that works to call it product.find. All right, so find a record for database, so that's good. So we're in there. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this connection. Well, actually, let's write it out in pseudocode first. So let's connect to the database. Okay, and then let's create some kind of SQL statement. But now here's the interesting thing. Okay, we can't just execute that statement. We do need to execute the statement, no question. But when we execute that statement, we need to actually do something with the results that we get back. Okay. So what we want to do is convert the results into product objects. Okay, or a product object in this case. Okay, so let's see how that works. Okay, so connecting to the database. All right. So we can grab this guy, which copy and paste that code for now. Okay, so connect to the database. Then what we're going to do is we'll create a command. So our command is going to be select star from products where the ID is equal to the ID that gets passed in, right? This ID here. So we'll just say plus ID. Now again, just like before, let's output this just to see what it looks like. Oh, forgot to convert this to a string. There we go. Select star from products where ID is equal to 3. That's perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now again, if we change that number, does it change the SQL statement properly? Yes, it does. Okay, there we go. Select star from products where ID equals 5. Okay. So what we can do then is we have the ID to, sorry, we have the record now to, the command to execute. So let's actually execute that command. So we're going to say connection.execute command. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is, again, knowing the PG library ahead of time, but you'd have to research this, is this is going to return a set of results. Okay. So let's see what those results look like. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say output the results.size, and that will tell us how many actually came back. Okay. Find undefined method size for PG results. Oh, okay. So it looks like there is no size on that. What is on that actually? So here is the result set. This is the documentation. And I don't know actually how to get the result set size, but we'll leave that for now, since I don't know how to do it. But what I do know is that results is kind of like it's a collection, like an array that you can iterate over. Okay, and this is how you do. This is how you iterate over an array in Ruby or over an iterator. And let's just see what those rows look like. Actually, let's just put the word hello for every time there's a row in that. Okay, so what we're doing is we're executing a select statement, and all the rows that come back, let's just iterate over those rows, and for each row, let's just put the word hello, and that'll give us an indication of how many records we actually have there, right? Okay, so hello was printed once, which means we have one row. Okay, so let's take a look at what that row is. So what's really cool about how the PG library does this is the row that comes back in the results, you can actually access the columns from it just by doing this, basically accessing the hash key. Okay. So I'll just do that. And that should output the ID. Perfect, 5. Which makes sense, right? We select star from products where the ID is equal to 5. And then the result that comes back, we should look at the ID 5. So let's look at how that looks in here. So if we did this where ID equals 5, this is the row that gets returned, right? This is the row here. So if I access the ID of that row, we get the number 5. So let's access the name, the price, and the serial number of that row and see what we get. So if we access the name, the price, and the serial number, what do we get? Perfect. So we get the 5, this, and this. Okay. Let's see what happens if we change. Here, let me make this a little bit smaller so you guys can see. So let's say if I change the ID to 3, we should get a different record back. So we get 3 iPhone SE, 399 IPSC. Let's see if I go 2. All right, so that's great. So you can already see how the find is taking the complexity out of the SQL statement. I can just call find whatever and I'm getting what I want, right? Now, the only thing is all I've been doing so far is outputting it to the screen. We actually want this to be in an object form. So that's the last step here. Okay, so we know what this does right here. Okay, so it grabs all the results here and puts it out to here. Okay, so I believe what we can do is we can just grab the first result. Okay. So I'm just going to grab the very first result. And if I do that, I'm not going to iterate over them. I'm just going to grab the first one that comes back, which should only be 1 in this case. And I believe I can just now access the columns of that. So let's run this one more time. Yep, same idea. Okay, so rather than iterating over them and outputting them, I'm just going to grab the first result and output them there. Okay, so this is the row that I'm dealing with. If it's more clear, I can change this to just row. Okay, so grab the very first row. All right, make sure that still works. There we go. Okay, and now the last step is to convert this row into an actual product object. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to instantiate a brand new object to hold this data. Okay, so remember, I am inside a class method, so no instance has been created yet. So I'm going to create a brand new instance. Okay, but now remember, when we create a new instance, we have these nice getters and setters. But even better, we have this constructor where we can just pass all those things directly in there, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a brand new product where the ID is coming from the row, the name is coming from the row, the price is coming from the row, and the serial number is coming from the row. Now, there's a couple things we have to do here because I'm just going to put these on new lines just so it's easier to read. Now, unfortunately, all the results come back as strings, so we do have to massage these a little bit to be in the data that we want it in. So the ID came back as a string, so we just want to convert that to an integer, so to I. Name is a string, so we can leave that. Price we want to convert to a float value, so 2F will convert that to a float value, and then the serial number is just a string. Okay, so that converts it, creates a brand new product, okay? And now we just want to return that product. Okay, so let's walk through that again. We connected to the database, we executed a SQL statement. Okay, that SQL statement returned a set of results. From those set of results, we grabbed the very first row. And from that row, we instantiated a brand new product and returned that product. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Okay, so it ran fine. So at this point, that product that was returned should be this right here. So let's see if that's actually the case. So if I output now the product's ID, the product's name, the product's, what do we say, price, and the product's serial number. Okay, call those methods on that object. Okay, let's see what happens. And there we go. Okay. So this is finding the record in the database, and then it's done finding it. Okay. And then we run into this code here where we output those values. Okay. So let's take out the code where we're finding it. Okay. So this is finding it. So let's take out this output here. And there we go. Okay. So now that's done finding it. You can see the records there. Okay, so now we have a very powerful method to get data from the database. Okay, so now I could say find record number 5. And there you go. It's right there. Okay, find record number 3. Or we did 3 already. 2. Okay, and there's 2. Okay. All right, perfect. So now you can see how once you've coded those 2 methods, it's really easy to save things to the database and now find things from the database. Okay. Now, we'll only have about 13 minutes left before I usually wrap things up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple more methods, but I'm not going to talk in depth about how they work. I'm just going to talk very quickly about how to do them, but it's the same principle that we're doing here. Okay. All right. So let's start with an all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method called self.all. And what that's going to do is return all the records from the database, okay? All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to get rid of all these extra log messages now that we know everything's working. Okay. All right, so all, what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to connect to the database. Okay. Have my custom command here. Now my command is just going to be select star from products. Okay, just get them all. I'm going to execute that statement and get the results there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty array called products. Okay. And I'm going to iterate over the results. So what I'm going to do is going to say results.each. Okay. And for each result, I'm going to create a brand new product and instantiate that with the ID converted to an integer, the name, the price converted to a float, and the serial number. Okay, so I'll create a brand new product. And then what I'm going to do is just going to add that product to my array. This is how it's kind of like dot push, like pushing that onto the array. And after all that's done, I am going to return all those products. Okay, so a collection of products comes back. Okay, so now if I come back up here, so what I can do is I could do products equals product.all. And let's just output, say, the size of that array. Okay. And let's see how many come back. 5 came back. Okay, that's great. All right, so what we could do is I could iterate over those products. All right. And let's say for each one, I output the name. Okay. And there you go. Output all the name from the database. Okay. Maybe I output the name and the price. Oh, what did I mess up there? Get price. Oh, this is a float. Got to convert it back to a string. There we go. Got all them and all the prices there, okay? Which is great. And one thing you should be taking note of here is that the program is done. It finishes the program, yet I can run this multiple times and that data is still there, right? So there, we got persistent data. All right, so that's great there. And I'm going to show you one more called, let's do not a class method, but I'm just going to create one called destroy or delete. Okay, let's use delete to keep things simple. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to the database and create this. So we're going to do some command. And then we're going to execute that statement. Okay, so again, let's grab the connection. Okay, my command is going to be delete from products where the ID is equal to, again, and be careful of this, do not do this in production because you could be vulnerable to SQL injection, but we're going to do the ID of that instance, okay? Because don't forget, this is an instance method versus a class method. We actually have access to these instance methods. Okay, and then we're going to actually execute that statement. Okay. So here's an interesting thing. So now I need to find a record and then delete it. Okay. So if we look at our database right now, we have how many records in the database? We have 5 records in the database. And let's say I want to delete item number 3 here. So what I should do using the ORM is grab that record and then delete it. Okay. So now that I have my ORM, what I can do is I could do product equals product.find 3. Okay, so that's going to grab this record, convert it into a instance, and now I can just call product.delete. So let's try that. So run that. Oh, again, keep forgetting to convert these. Okay, so that's done. So what theoretically happened there is it extracted the data into an object of product, and then I called delete on it, which then sent another command to the SQL database to delete item number 3. So if I run this, you'll see it's now gone. Okay, and that's that. So that is a very quick, simple example of an ORM. Okay, now there's obviously a couple things here that are not ideal. I am going to put in very big warning here because I'm going to check this into GitHub so you guys can view it afterwards. But I'm going to put a very big warning here about the SQL injection. Maybe that's overemphasizing that part. And is vulnerable to SQL injection. All right. But anyway, so there you go. You have an idea now of how you might write a class that has convenience methods to basically go back and forth from the database. Because after you've written this now, you can just freely use the code in here as a developer. Okay, that's your development tool. Okay, so that is ORM in a nutshell. There are definitely things I've left out here. One of the questions that might come up in your head is, well, how do I know if I want to do an insert or an update? I haven't done an update here, right? So you might do two different methods. You might do a create method, okay, and an update method. You could do that, right? Ruby on Rails handles this slightly differently. They consider any record that doesn't have an ID as not saved. As not in the database. So they do a insert in that case, and otherwise they do an update. So things like that, right? So I haven't done everything, but now hopefully you have an idea of how to actually get your data from your application into your database in a relatively organized way. Okay, so I might do this now for users as well, and so on and so forth. And eventually what you're going to see is you're going to have a lot of repetition, right? So like, for example, this connection string has been repeated a lot. So you may extract that out to a common method. In fact, if you look at this insert, the insert is very similar, would be very similar for users. The only thing that would change would be the name of the table and the values that you're passing in, right? So there are ways to leverage that, right? And so what a lot of these ORMs do is allow you to just include or extend these things, and because they have it all coded all together. Because once you write your own ORM, you'll start to realize that there's a lot of repeated code. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of what an ORM is. I actually encourage you guys that if you're writing your first app, why not write the ORM yourself? You know, start off yourself. You don't need much more than what you have here, like save, delete, find, all, you know, and update, things like that. Now, I will say, though, when you get to more complex applications, you might want to use an ORM library because they do a lot of more powerful things here. Like another thing here, for example, is we don't have a way to select certain records, right? We only can select all records, an individual record, but I can't say, give me all the products where the price is greater than something, right? I have to write a custom query, a custom method for that as well, right? So ORMs are generally a lot bigger than this, but this definitely should give you an idea of what an ORM looks like. So I do want to thank the couple of people who did stick with me all night. I'm going to start wrapping things up, but if you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to ask. This is the first time, I should say second time. I did do this one time. But what's interesting is I really learned about ORMs through Ruby on Rails. And this is why I stand by that Ruby on Rails is still one of the best frameworks out there, because it teaches you really good practices that you can apply to other languages and other frameworks. So I didn't really fully know about ORMs before Ruby on Rails. It turns out, at one of my early jobs, I was using an ORM that was coded by the architect there. But I just didn't realize at the time. But now that I know ORMs, when I go to a project that doesn't have an ORM, I generally tend to code things like this, right? And that's how I ended up coding my first ORM a couple years ago. But I don't usually do this in my day-to-day job. My day-to-day job, I just use a library, right? So Ruby on Rails comes with an implementation of Active Record that has all this stuff built in, right? And obviously their code is a lot more complex than this, but what's nice is that you can kind of guess that this is kind of what it's doing, right? It's not exactly like this, but yeah, it's definitely probably similar algorithms that are happening, right? If you decide that you really want to code this in production mode and you want to avoid what I just talked about, SQL injection, what you want to look up again is prepared statements. Okay. That's one of their names. I can't remember what the other names are, but what those effectively do is they sanitize the parts that you're interpolating, right? So if I'm putting in the ID or the name or the price or these kind of things, it's going to sanitize those so that they can't be used harmfully, basically, right? So you want to look that up if you want to kind of do that in production. So but yeah, so that's pretty much it. Again, really happy how this series is going, guys, and I do really appreciate the people who did join us tonight. If you have any questions, definitely let me know in the chat, or definitely you can always message on the recorded video afterwards and I'll try to get back to you. You can always, again, message me on Twitter. Subscribe to me, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon, and again, definitely suggest any other topics that you guys have. Definitely, as I mentioned in the beginning, I definitely struggled to come up with a topic this time, but hopefully I won't have the same thing next time. But I definitely really want to keep this going every Thursday night. It's been really fun, and it's been really great having the feedback that I'm having. Dave Chapman, have you used a query builder before? If so, how would that compare to an ORM? So I have not used a query builder before. I'm assuming a query builder is kind of similar to what Ruby on Rails does with its ARL statements, like the .where and the .joins and things like that. I have not used a query builder. I'm assuming a query builder, what it does, from what I can guess, is that a query builder still requires you to understand the underpinnings of SQL, or depending whatever database you're using. So I'm assuming that it requires you to understand that you are you're adding a where clause or a join, or, certain values or whatever, or orders or limits and stuff like that, and requires you to understand that, which obviously that Ruby on Rails supports. Whereas in my opinion, an ORM tries to abstract as much of that as they can, right? So if I look at Ruby on Rails Active Record implementation, maybe that part is not part of Active Record, so appropriately it's the query builder versus the ORM. And again, I'm completely taking a shot in the dark here. So my guess is that a ORM is, again, more abstracting that. So if you look at using an ORM like we did, I keep forgetting to switch back. If you look at an ORM like we did, after the ORM was built, you didn't need to know anything about what was going on underneath. For all you knew, find could have been an update statement or insert statement. You don't know that, right? And so that's completely abstracted from the user, right? So an ORM, you don't really need to know that. You really just deal with the objects themselves. And a query builder, I'm assuming you have to kind of understand a little bit what's going on underneath the hood. And what's nice about programs like or frameworks like Ruby on Rails is that it actually supports both, if I'm right about what a query builder is. So yes, I sorry, live stream, because again, this really came from your idea. So hopefully you were able to understand some of the ORM stuff. Mark is a web developer, a really great web developer, great designer as well. So we've got two great web developers here, Dave and Mark, which is awesome. And Mark, hopefully you learned a little bit here, and getting into storing your data in databases. Once your database is set up and Mark, I can't remember, but you've done Python or you've done Rails or whatever, Node. I think you did Node. So Node Express, you can then start writing stuff to the database and reading stuff from the database and build your own ORM if you're not already using an ORM. So So big thanks to Dave and Mark for joining us tonight. Really thank you guys for keeping the live part live. Really, really appreciate that. But definitely spread the word to anybody else that you guys know. But I do know we do get a decent amount of views on these videos after they post. So I really want to thank the people who've been watching and supporting this channel and this video, and specifically this video series. I really, really appreciate it. Dave Chapman, good guess. Errol is absolutely a query builder and what Active Record is built upon, right? I've done a bit of Rails, but I'm more into Node and .NET guy. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So Dave, awesome. That's cool. Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That Active Record is built on ARL, right? Yeah, because ARL you can build up your queries, and then Active Record would be the ORM that's based on top of that. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. ARL, by the way, is a really, really powerful tool. A long time ago, I did some Ruby code, and I got, I believe his name is John Duff at Shopify. It's somebody Duff. I believe it's John Duff. Got him to review my code. I didn't really know him. He just said, hey, anybody can send me a PR. And then he reviewed my code, and he taught me about the power of ARL and how it builds up your query before executing. And that really changed. It's one of those things that it didn't change the way I program, but definitely like was one of those lessons that stuck in my head all these years later. Like that was like 10 years ago, stuck in my head. So really interesting. And yeah, Mark, so if you've done Node.js, you should definitely either consider building your own or check out, what was the other one that I had up on there? Definitely check out Sequelize or TypeORM. TypeORM is specific to TypeScript, though, I believe. So you'd have to use TypeScript. If you're not using TypeScript and just using JavaScript, then you can look into something like Sequelize. But they're a great way, again, to get your data out of your objects into the database, or out of your database and into your objects, and make this a lot easier. So cool. All right. So again, thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the little bit of chat that we're having at the end here. Again, makes things always a little bit more exciting. Hopefully you guys are staying safe and healthy. Definitely let me know if there are any other questions, or if you have any other topics that you would like me to do. A couple things I have been mulling around. We recreated the Airbnb landing page. I'd like to at some point get to the Uber landing page, just as another exercise. It'd be nice to do something in React at some point, and talk a little bit about React. React is definitely an awesome framework that I really love. It'd be really nice to talk a little bit about that. Firebase is another thing that'd be pretty cool to talk about. I'd like to do Firebase at some point. Expo is really awesome. Expo, I'd love to show people how easy it is to get up and running and build a mobile app. Expo is really awesome for that. Mark apparently has been using Prisma for a project, but we'll definitely learn Sequelize type ORM. I mean, if Prisma is a ORM, that's totally fine too. Like I don't need to use what I'm recommending here. I mean, it's literally so Prisma Node. What is Prisma? Database tools for modern application development. Replaces traditional ORMs. Interesting. Prisma makes database access easy with an auto-generated and type-safe query. Oh, it's like, there you go. It's all coming full circle. So Dave mentioned about query builder. So yeah, this is perfect. So Mark, Prisma is a query builder, it looks like. So you kind of build your queries using objects, or sorry, not objects, like methods that they provide you. But then you could probably have a ORM that's on top of it. Provides an alternative to traditional ORMs. Oh, mind you though, it says alternative to SQL query builds and ORM. So yeah, again, nothing wrong with it. ORM is just one thing. It's one way to deal with your data. There are a lot of people who are like, let's abandon ORM. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of my Ruby on Rails day-to-day work where I just use query builders. So don't abandon it just because somebody else told you about it. But always good to try ORMs. Like again, when I tried an ORM, I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. ORMs are one of the reasons that I said like, wow, like Ruby on Rails is one of the greatest things ever. But then I found out later that there are ORMs for like all these different languages. So test-driven development is another topic maybe that Dave is suggesting that maybe I cover. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Test-driven development is something that I I don't know how good of a person I would be to cover it, in the sense that um I don't practice it as much as maybe, like, on one hand I say I don't practice it as much as I should, but then on the other hand, you know, I don't want to sell myself short either. I am a working web developer. I'm not working on the biggest products out there, and I definitely I have to take this into context of what the typical app size that I build is. But test-driven development is something that I don't necessarily do, but I definitely do automated tests. So I definitely do automate. I definitely write tests, but I very rarely write tests first and then drive the development from that. And I really like a lot of the concepts, and I really like the philosophy behind it. But in practice, I don't really do it a lot, and I haven't found it biting me too bad, as long as I'm still writing automated tests. I find automated tests really give me the sense of security, and give me a sense of like, okay, the app's not going to completely blow up on me, and I can upgrade easily and things like that. But in terms of test-driven development and behavior-driven development, and how it really dictates how your code comes together, all those philosophies, as much as I believe in them, I don't actually exercise them that much in practice. So maybe that in itself is a good discussion to have, or maybe something to talk about in one of these talks, test-driven development. So I would definitely note that down as something to maybe at least tell people and show people, and kind of talk about it and explain it, and really let people decide for themselves how much it is. Because as much as I've tried to do it, I find myself always steering towards kind of getting things out there as fast as I can, which is really, I know in some ways a bad practice, but in other ways I haven't really run into massive issues from not doing full blown test driven development. But that then again, the apps that I build are relatively small scale compared to things like, say, you know, Facebook, LinkedIn, you know, Airbnb, these kind of apps. So a lot of interesting discussion to be had around there. I definitely don't disagree with it. So that's definitely something I would be interested to cover. I also started to think about maybe covering some more process oriented stuff. So kind of like Scrum, like what I like to call maybe Scrum Light, kind of my version of Scrum and what we use at BiteSite. You know, maybe some Git practices and Git structures and stuff like that might be interesting to cover. But yeah, definitely open to what you guys are into. We're all of a sudden getting more viewers. More viewers are joining now. We have 4 or 5 people on now. So I guess just at the tail end here, unless you guys are just reconnecting or whatever. But for the people who just joined us, if you guys have any more questions, feel free to keep this talk going. Like it's like I'm probably gonna end it in the next little bit, but always happy to have more people on the chat or on the stream. So, but yeah, so I've thought about processes and things like that. I also don't know if there's any audience for, again, the startup side of things. Again, like kind of building a company. Again, I have not a ton of experience building product companies. But again, just starting kind of freelancing or service-based companies is definitely something that I could talk about. But again, I think it looks like the audience here is generally tending more towards technical, kind of maybe a little bit more low-level coding stuff. But there could be also some things, again, halfway in between, like I said, about process management, right? Product management's another great topic. Again, Dave on the call here, he's taught me a lot about product management and philosophies behind product. My good friend Aaron has also taught me a lot of good things about product management. And then my experience in the last 5 or 6 years actually has taught me a lot about product management and kind of deciding what's important to build and what's not important to build, things like that. So again, other topics like deployment, you know, things like that. And then really the other aspect of this is maybe covering just some low level stuff, right? Like maybe covering like just low level Ruby tutorials or Rails tutorials or React tutorials or JavaScript tutorials, things like that, right? I don't know if there's an interest for that. It's a little bit harder to do those in a kind of way without just doing like 8 straight live streams about it or something like that. But if that's what people are interested in, I'm definitely open to that. So okay, so I think I'm going to end it there, guys. Again, thanks so much for joining. If you are not already subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon so you're notified. But basically every Thursday night at 8 p.m. I'm going to be doing this. follow me on Twitter and leave me messages there, or leave me messages on the recorded stream or whatever. Very happy to have you guys. Big thanks to Dave and Mark for asking your questions. Thanks for everyone else who joined. Thanks for those who have been watching on the recorded streams as well. And thanks for the people who are giving me the feedback on Twitter and LinkedIn and things like that. Again, it really makes this worth it. I get really excited every Thursday to do one of these. So really happy to have you guys join us. Some point we're going to just amp up this thing and really get going. But really thanks guys so much. I'm going to stay on the chat for maybe a couple minutes after this, but thanks so much. We'll see you guys next Thursday. Have no idea what it's going to be about, but hopefully it'll be worth your while. All right. See you guys later.